what we know from going through the boot camp is that startups are organizations that are building proof, right? And you're building proof that you can say that your startup is sustainable, repeatable, and that it has a scalable business model. So that's what investors want to know from your startup. And as part of Unitus Seed Fund and some of the stuff that I'm doing with Venture Base Camp, we have what we call these critical success factors for startups. And this is something that Forge and us share, where we look at the science behind startups, right? So we have team, viewpoint, value proposition, product, go-to-market strategy, customer interaction, competition, business model, and funding strategy. And the question is, how do you kind of tackle all these things when you're talking to an investor, right? And there's this accelerator that I work with very closely in Seattle called 9 Mile Labs, and I think that this is something that a lot of entrepreneurs find very interesting. Because basically what their thesis is that there are stages to getting to an investable startup, right?
So in the previous slide, is there a priority or these are all equally weighted?
It depends on the VC. So I mean, most VCs would say like the biggest priority is the team, right? That's the most important thing. Do you have a team that can execute? And we'll kind of get into that. Yeah, I mean, it's team. Do you have a large market? Are you disrupting something? Do you have IP that differentiates you from other people? So I want you guys to kind of like take a step back and kind of look through this. There are a lot of different ideas and concepts that we've been working through. So we have Projects for School, which is part of Venture Base Camp. We're kind of going through and tackling like these different topics. But one of the things that investors are very interested in looking at is a well-balanced team. So that's the hustler, hacker, and visionary. And if we kind of describe the hustler, hacker, visionary, the hustler is that person that's doing sales and business development, right? And the hacker is the person usually going through the product, usually a coder or somebody like that, really focusing on product development. And then the visionary is kind of that CEO, entrepreneur driving the execution strategy. If you look at pain point, you want a pain point that is very, very large, so it has a large market, and that people really feel it. So it's not only a need, but it's also a want. And you kind of have to differentiate between those two. Because I think that this is very relevant for education startups where you know that there are like significant needs in the market, right? And the question is like, is the market ready for that? And do they actually want your product? Because that's the adoption, right? And then if you go to competition, we were talking about this earlier, you know, who are your competitors? There are active competitors that are, you know, other startups that are trying to inject into the market as well. They might already be there. There's also the competition of just the status quo. Do people actually want to adopt your startup technology? Value proposition is that, you know, there's a significant contribution that the customer sees. There's a benefit that they know is there. And basically, like, a lot of it is like how much money or time you can save. That's like, those are the big things that people look at. Are there any other things that don't really make sense?
What's the last row? Is that like,
Last row.
like an assessment path that what are you doing?
This one? Yeah, essentially. So you have red, yellow, green. And basically, so if we take team, for example, you have a leadership team that's incomplete. And then when you're kind of in a better position is when you have that hustler, hacker, and visionary. So you have something that kind of, it's a balanced team. So you're like, okay, you have the people in place. And the next question is, are they actually able to build a culture where they make this startup exciting and people actually want to come and join that startup? So that's when it's like, okay, this is a strong team. We're going to go through, think like an investor now. And I talked about this before, but I like to call investors skeptical optimists because, as I said, like, you know, investors aren't really horrible people. They kind of get bombarded by a lot of entrepreneurs all the time. So I see a lot of my like fellow investors that kind of like shut themselves off. So they're just like, oh God, it's another entrepreneur. I can't handle this right now. So what you kind of have to do is you have to prove that your startup is functioning well and that it's actually a very interesting proposition. Because part of the deal is that VCs aren't in VC because they're not risk takers. They do take risks. And they're excited to see startups thrive and grow, but you just have to convince them that you're the startup that's going to be successful. And then once you get to that point, they're going to be really excited and they're going to work their asses off to help you guys. Usually, if it's good VC. So what do investors actually want to know about you? I recommend writing this down. So the question is, do you have a unique idea? Are you solving a real problem that affects a lot of people? That's how you got that market, right? That critical pain that market says. Does your product actually have a compelling value proposition? So does that resonate with your audience and the different channels that you're going through? And then the big one is, can you prove traction? And traction is kind of one of those terms that a lot of people throw out there. And how do you guys define traction?
Paying customer. Number of paying customers.
Paying customers, yeah. How many? Depends, right? So what do you think make it good? So let's say that you're B2B. What do you think, if you went to a VC and you said, like, I have decent traction?
25 paying customers.
How big is the market? Let's talk percentages of that.
0.5%
Of the total addressable market?
addressable market, what the number I gave. 150 companies in Bangalore, out of which 2%, 3% have already.
Anybody else?
Will be the rate of customer acquisition in terms of quantum time.
Yeah.
Have you been able to improve it over quantum time?
Yeah. So something that's very interesting is like growth metrics, right? So you're looking at week over week, month over month. Are things actually increasing? That's kind of the question that they're looking at.
Was it one good customer who's like representative of the market?
One customer?
Yeah.
No. We're a VC. What do you think?
One
You
time-
can invest
one time
in one
market.
customer?
One time wonder, right?
Yeah. It's like the Macarena. Have you ever heard that band after that?
And even for a nuclear reactor, it has to do.
Exactly. Thanks for being very attentive. See, it's also, traction, like I said, there are lots of proxies for revenue or just number of customers, right? For example, you made a point about repeat.
Yeah.
What's the fun in acquiring 10 customers but losing 8 of them after the first transaction? What if they don't come back?
Yep.
Right, so repeat matters more than sheer numbers.
So here's a good example.
Right.
We were talking about this during we just did a module on product market fit. And basically, if you look at Snapchat in their very early stages and you look at their usage, it's really like what they have is phenomenal. So you look at how much early stage investing they got, and if you look at their metrics, so I think that within a couple months they had 200,000 users on Snapchat, and 100,000 of those were daily active users. That just changed. Yeah, so 100,000 of those were daily active users, and of those 100,000, they would upload at least 10 snaps per day. So that's, you have a strong base, and they're using it a lot, and they're using it consistently per day.
So in
that's
cases where there is no clear revenue, where you're not able to monetize, right, then usage becomes very, very important, right? And if you look at all of those business models where there has been usage-driven funding or investments, you will find very high quality of usage. So rapid adoption, very high, repeat or
Yeah,
very low
stickiness, is that-
stickiness. Yeah, very high stickiness. And usage, so usage in terms of how many, if there are 10 important features in your product or service, are all of them used? Right? That is a very important indicator if you're not monetizing and if you're only driving a usage, like a user base, then don't just look at numbers. It does not at all tell the entire story. I want to look at the quality of the usage,
Yeah.
right? The degree of the scope or the extent of how well it is used. Or just one feature used, it's just one feature out of those 10 features used, and the others are just not even touched. And why did you guys miss it?
So one thing that frustrates me about a lot of VCs is that they throw out this jargon, And a lot of entrepreneurs don't necessarily know exactly what they mean. And like I was in the same position when I was just starting out at Unitus, where I didn't really understand that jargon. So somebody said traction, I was like, oh, yeah, traction, totally. Know what you're talking about. But yeah, so I mean, when you're talking about traction, it's looking at that usage and if it's consistent. Because the biggest thing that speaks to a startup is how many customers you have and how active they are with your product or service. So there are 6 steps. That's 6 steps, right? Yeah. There are 6 steps to rocking your investor's world. And the first one is to understand what the objective is. So when you go in and you talk to an investor, what are you expecting out of that conversation? And are those expectations correct, right? So if you're just starting to introduce yourself to an investor, let's say that you're at a demo day and you have a teaser pitch, what's going to come out of that? Do you think that they're instantly going to be like, take my money, this is awesome? It's probably not going to happen. So you have to set your expectation. Your expectation should probably be, I want the VC to come and talk to me, or maybe I'll reach out to them and we can start a conversation about this. Just like be realistic. If you're at a bar and you need a VC, what do you think the expectation should be?
Have a drink.
Have a drink.
Does he pay the bill?
Depends on how good your startup is.
Yeah.
Depends on how much
It's an indicator of success.
Yeah. And then the next thing is that you have to understand the way that investors think. And you're not only investors, but the audience that you're presenting to. This is where empathy comes in. You have to just understand what their expectations are as well. So you can kind of, tailor what you're talking about to match them. Because a lot of times, like if I think I was at this IIT Bombay conference a couple months ago. And there's this guy that was working on this solar energy problem. And I'm not very well versed in solar power, and I'm not an engineer. I come from an economics background. And he just came up and he started throwing this jargon at me about solar energy. I was just like, oh my God, please just like speak to me like I'm an idiot because I don't understand what you're talking about. So he broke it down and it made a lot of sense after that. So you just kind of have to get on other people's levels and understand like the way that you're talking has to resonate with them, which we'll get into a little bit. The next one is telling the story from their perspective. So understanding what their position is, what their level of knowledge about what you're talking about is what we were saying earlier is that entrepreneurs have a very, very deep understanding of the market, whereas let's say VCs have a couple of different markets that they're pretty familiar with. So they don't have the depth of knowledge, they might not know as much jargon as you do. To kind of break free from the jargon. Yeah.
See, the initial slide, we were talking about some of the segments where people have not invested, right? So, yeah, this. So, this, how do you correlate in understanding why investor? I'm looking, of course, I will do a little study about portfolio companies, investor and all that. But does this give any indication which I'm missing that there are some preferable segments and there are some segments which they are very scared of, something like that?
It's a difficult question. A lot of it is just understanding, looking through your portfolio, reading their investment thesis.
Okay.
Things like that.
So if something which they do not have in their current portfolio, where do I stand a chance or?
Ask them.
Okay.
Yeah, it could be lack of supply. What if there were good ideas coming in from that sector? So if careful learning is zero, maybe there wasn't an investable idea or a startup that came from that sector. It's not that they are not interested.
Or is the risk associated is much higher than?
So which is why, unless you ask, there could be any number of scenarios.
Okay.
Any number of reasons why that number is zero, whereas another number is high.
Well, I think that's allocated.
Perhaps.
I think training section also, which is seen as zero, is not a true figure.
No. See, I mean, the fact is like, not all the sectors are too very compelling or interesting for an investor because the risk associated. So I'm not questioning the number per se. I'm only trying to understand, just correlating with the number. What is that from an investor's point of view? I mean, do they prefer to have more technology-enabled initiatives or human-intensive initiatives, or is it a blend they're looking at? That's something which
So for Unitus, we focus on technology a lot because it's very difficult to scale the human side of things, right? So when you talk to a lot of VCs, they're looking for that 10x return, which means high scalability. And that's why I think it's difficult from the entrepreneur's perspective to kind of, distance yourself away from like what your startup is doing and kind of look at it objectively, right? So then the question is this a high scale? Is there potential for high scale? So is this suited for a VC? Because it might not necessarily be that, your product or your startup is bad, or your company is bad, but it might not be something that VC is interested in investing in, because it doesn't have that high scale return.
Thank you.
So then, since we're focusing on pitching, because you guys are going to pitch at the end of this, right? Or it's going to narrow down to
the top 8.
top 8 that will pitch.
And then they'll still do a pitch interview.
Okay. Yeah. So what we kind of want to talk about is making sure that your presentation, the way that you present it, the content that you present is effective and compelling. And then you have to practice and you have to test it with other people, see whether it resonates before you go and pitch it. So we talked about this. What is the actual output? And if you're going through like a demo day situation, the idea is a conversation with a VC. If you're going through a competition, then figure out what the rubric is and make sure that you tackle all those points. Right? Do they have access to the rubric yet? Or?
No.
No? Okay.
I'll choose that one.
And then one of the biggest things is that you have to excite people, right? Because if you're going through a bunch of different pitches, the ones that really resonate with you are the ones that people are gonna remember you for. So, one big thing is to know your investor, and this happens all the time. Even I had this one startup come to me from like a pretty prominent accelerator. And they didn't even bother they knew that we were interested in fintech, but they didn't even bother to pay attention to like how we define impact and what we're actually interested in investing in. Because it turns out that the market that they were looking at was, white collar, upper class people that would go out and go to like luxury restaurants and want to split the bill. So that's what he was pitching to me, and I was sitting there, I was like, I'm sorry, but this is not part of our investment thesis at all. And I was nicer about it. But it's just frustrating when you have entrepreneurs coming to you and like you can't necessarily help them because they don't fit your investment thesis. So make sure that you know who you're talking to. And do your research, go online, look at their investment thesis, look at other portfolio companies that they have. And the question is your company far too similar to a portfolio company that they have? And then, the question is like, what is your question after that? So do you want to get feedback from them, or do you want to actually try to get invested? It's unlikely that we would invest in a startup that is so similar and would be direct competition with one of our other portfolio companies, right? And then, what we were talking about, ask questions. I think that most VCs, they want to help entrepreneurs. And if you actually reach out and make sure that you guys are on the right page, a lot of VCs actually really appreciate that. You say, let me just get this straight. I don't want to waste your time, so I just have these couple of questions to ask you. So I have a couple of case studies. Did you guys all receive the Thinking Like an Investors series? Yeah. Okay, so the case studies kind of go a bit in depth, but I did some of the research for you guys, and I reached out to some of the people that I know at these different funds. And kind of interviewed them. So you can have a breakdown of what they're interested in investing in, what stage they're in, and all that stuff. But if you look at Unitus Seed Fund, the number one thing is that we want a well-rounded team. Second is that we want differentiation and market opportunity. So we want a really big market that you compete against your competitor. I guess, how do you define that? Differentiation. How do you define differentiation that makes a lot of sense?
Understand the gaps, existing gaps, and give a practically workable solution for that. Which could also improve your customer action scale.
Okay. So it's the things that set you apart from your competitors, as well as the status quo, right? So it's not only that, but it's also why people would want to adopt your product or service, right? And then for us, since we're impact, yeah.
When you talk about market opportunity, do you have a range of number that you look
It depends on the market.
for education?
I don't have exact numbers with me. But I mean, even in education, there are different markets there as well. What they're basically looking at is, the potential to scale within that market. And if it's big enough, one thing that we're also interested in looking at is like whether there's potential to scale globally. Because one thing about Unitus Seed Fund is that we're under this company called Prather Ventures, which just started up last year. And basically they're creating new seed funds throughout the world. So right now we have this global network of different seed funds. So that's something that we're very interested in right now. So then you have Axel. And Axel is like a top dog fund. They just go online and look at their portfolio companies. It's absolutely insane. But what they look at is, a lot of the same stuff, where they have market size, team, product market fit. And product market fit is another tricky one that a lot of people throw out that word, but it's difficult to define, which we went through in the workshop this past week. So how would you guys define product market fit?
Is there a demand for the product in the market?
So how will your product solve the problem in the market?
Wouldn't you define that as like, say, problem solution fit?
Economically viable is your product.
So this is one of those terms that a lot of people throw out and they forget to actually define it. And there are basically 3 stages, right? You have problem solution fit, where you know that your product or service solves a critical pain, right? That's the first step. And then if you look at the progression of the startup, you have the startup stage, and then it goes through a transition stage, and then it goes through a growth stage. And when you're in that startup stage, the biggest priority is product market fit, and it's baffling that people don't pay attention to actually understanding what it is. And when you're talking about product market fit, you're not only looking at the actual product, but you're looking, I wonder if I can,
Was that, sorry?
I have this one slide that I used in, but basically, when you're looking at product market fit, you're looking at have you guys ever seen Lean Canvas? Yeah? Okay, so basically they're like, yeah, so it's Ashmore. It's kind of like a brainstorming page for startups, right? But you have things like the problem that you're solving, the metrics that you use to figure out whether it's actually being solved, value proposition as well as costs. And that's all what's part of the product, right? And then you have the market, which is the customer segments as well as the value proposition, as well as what am I saying? It's channels and revenue streams. And that's the market side. So product market fit is the combination of those 2 things. It's not just your product. So it's kind of misleading in that sense. But the best way to test product market fit is to put your product out there and then take it away and see if your users, shout and scream. Which means that this can only be, you can only have product market fit if you actually have a significant amount of traction, because you actually have users, right? And I think there's this guy, Sean Ellis, and he's like gone through a lot of different startups. I think he researched around 100 different startups, and he came up with this metric where I think if 40% of your user base would be really, really disappointed if you took away that product or service, that's a good indication that you have product market fit. So you have to have customers and users, ideally paying customers. And if you were to happen to take that product away, they would be really, really upset. Because that's when you know that you're solving a significant problem for them, right? So that term is, I think, one of the most frustrating terms for entrepreneurs, because people just throw it out. Right? Oh, product market fit, product market fit.
One of the things I recommend is to look in terms of what we call proof of product, which is enough number of similar customers that find the product useful, usable, and affordable.
Yeah.
Right. So it's product market. So what is a market? Market is group of similar customers, right? So it's not just one customer. It has to become a market. So it's enough number of same customers. So that's when a product now starts to look like it fits a market. Because there are enough number of those customers but it's the same product and it's useful, usable, and affordable. Which means you now have repeatability. So I can with confidence say, I put more money into building the product and I put more money into generating leads, the revenues will grow.
Yeah.
if I don't hit that fit, then I can't say that with enough conviction and confidence. There is still risk. Right? So it's almost like a threshold. Right? So I call it the number of customers, enough number of customers who find the same solution.
Yep.
Useful, usable kind of problem.
And don't want you to take it away from them.
Exactly.
So if you go back to those Snapchat metrics that I was talking about, that's their traction, but you can tell that they have product market fit in that traction because they have a lot of activity. And if you took Snapchat away from those people, they would be really sad. So I have a lot of friends, I'm really bad at Snapchat. I only have like one friend on there because I don't know how to use it. But I know that if you took it away from Divya, she would be devastated. For me, I'd be like, oh, darn. So we see team again here. These guys really focus on unit economics. That's their third priority. So I asked them to name their top 3 things that they look at. And then what Espada does is they really focus on disruptive innovation. That's their main thesis. So they want to make sure that you have some sort of tech solution that is disruptive in whatever market that you're looking at. And then here again, you have a large market size, and this is best. So these are like top dogs. These are the guys that invested in Twitter and Airbnb and things like madness. And they're looking for a large market with a significant customer pain point. They're looking for that product market fit again. And they want a strong team that can execute. So now you have Post-Lit Impact. And they're another impact VC fund. And they're looking for that stellar team, they're looking for that scalability, and they're looking for impact as well. And the reason why I kind of brought all these things together is because it kind of shows you the things that you really need to prioritize, not only building in your startup, but when you're talking to investors, really focusing on demonstrating that. Not only talking about it, but demonstrating it. Right. So does anybody have any questions? I'm sure you do, and I'll try to answer them. But
The strong team, how many people do you expect to be?
the number doesn't really matter as much as the capacity, right? So as a core startup like founding team, you might have 3. You might have that hustler, hacker, and visionary. You might have 4. You might have 2 people that act as hustlers, or maybe they kind of act as like a hustler visionary, or maybe a hacker visionary, that sort of thing. So as long as it's a well-rounded team. So you have the sales side, you have the development side, you have the execution side. That's what they're doing. There's another thing that we talked about in Venture Base Camp. It's called BOSI DNA. And what they talk about, so it's this, you can even Google it, it's like BOSI DNA. And basically this guy's gone around and looked at a bunch of different startups, and he kind of breaks it down into 4 different DNAs, he calls it. So you have the builder/scaler, and this is the guy that is really good at scaling companies and building companies from the ground up, and his main motivation, or her main motivation, is to create infrastructure, to kind of just like put it out there. And then you have the opportunists. So these are typically sales guys, and they're often motivated by returns on their sales, right? And they're the guys that get really excited to go out and like, talk to people and put things out there and have people be like, oh my God, take my money now, I need that. And then you have the specialists. And the specialists are typically people that are, coders, hackers. They resonate more with like that hacker side of things. And then you have innovators. And we see this a lot with like technologists where they create this technology and they care about it so much, and especially in impact where it's, health tech, for example. You found this like breakthrough technology and all you want to do is like have it go out and like save the world, right? You don't care how it does it, you don't care about making money, you just want to make a significant impact. But then the important thing is that you have to do all those things in order to make a strong business. Because if that innovator tries to do it alone, he's not going to make any money, he's not going to get out to market, and it's not going to survive. And then it's not going to impact anyone. So check out BOSI DNA. They also have this survey that you can take with your team, and they kind of like define like who you have on your team, and places that you might be missing somebody or some sort of skill set.
In terms of team, if you outsource part of your work, get someone else to do it, or freelancers to do part of your work, how does that work out with?
It depends on what the role is. So for instance, it depends on what, say for example you have legal issues that you have to get taken care of, outsource it. There's no significant reason to have that person on your team unless, say, you have a lot of legal issues coming up consistently. So for example, Airbnb at the scale that it is right now, they have legal issues in and out, in and out, in and out. And they have to have somebody on their team because it's a consistent activity that they go through, right? So when you're just starting out, and let's say that you're trying to get your certificate of incorporation, that's like a one-time thing. Maybe you have to deal with some legality issues. You can outsource things like that. If it's graphic design and you're not really focusing on graphic design, you might not necessarily need a full-time graphic designer, right? So it just depends on is that a core activity that your startup is engaging in?
So what if it is kind of your core is a tech platform and the part of your work has been done by someone outside, so how does that work?
I think it would be important to have a coder or programmer on your team. So you're saying that you outsource
So
it?
part of work.
Yeah, it depends on what that work is. If it's something that you regularly have to go to this guy to do, then maybe that's an indication that you should probably find somebody to fill in that gap. Next is PitchFest. We're going to kind of switch gears. So why do I have a goldfish up here? You guys know? There's some studies, I think a couple of years ago, that said
7 seconds.
7 second, that people pay attention. Yeah.
It's less
So, yeah, it's less than a goldfish, and people are saying that because we multitask so much nowadays, that it's really difficult for people to pay attention. And when you're talking to a lot of VCs, let's say that you're at a demo day and you have 15 startups that are pitching over and over and over again, it's not necessarily that the VC doesn't want to pay attention. I think it's really, really difficult at times. I've been sitting there my head will hurt intensely after the 13th pitch. I'm just oh my God, I try so hard to pay attention and give them the time that they deserve. I think it's really, really difficult. So you kind of have to hook them from the very beginning. But we'll get to that later. So a pitch is a way that you persuade people, and you have to persuade people to be excited about your startup. And one of the biggest things is that your pitch should tell the story of your startup. Not necessarily the story of the entrepreneur, but the story of your startup. So there are a couple of different types of pitches, and do you guys have your elevator pitch in place? Do you know exactly what your elevator pitch is? So if I come up to you and I say, so what do? You can go boom, 30 seconds, 60 seconds. Maybe this is a little equation I'll write down. So you have X is solving Y problem or value proposition by Z solution. So for instance, Uber is saving commuters time and money in their daily transportation needs by connecting drivers and riders via an app-based platform. So you know exactly what Uber's doing then. So a lot of times, when entrepreneurs come up to a VC and the VC says, oh, well, what do? You start to really focus on your product. You're oh, well, I have this awesome product, it's so exciting and stuff like that. And the VC sitting there saying, what is your startup about? That's what I want to know. I want to know what problem you're solving and how you're solving it. And then the next question is, can you do it profitably? So that's an elevator pitch. Another type of pitch that people like to do, so I like to consider this also a tweet pitch, so it's under 140 characters, that's the goal. There's also, people like to use, analogy pitches. So they say we are the Uber of bird watching or something like that. So that's an easy way to kind of demonstrate what you do, but I actually don't like those because they get pretty generic. So people start using them a lot over and over and over again, and they're just not that interesting to me anymore. So I prefer just get down to the nitty gritty of what you do, but make it very, very concise. So then you have the demo day / pitch competition. And this pitch is to get people excited, and the goal is to start those conversations, right? Because it's unlikely that you're going to get funded instantly after you stop pitching. And generally, these pitches are between 3 to 7 minutes. And essentially, as you break down the time that you have to pitch, it gets even harder and harder and harder, right? So when you're in college and you had to write a 20-page paper, I personally thought that a 20-page paper was a lot easier than trying to come up with that same idea within a page. Like, that was just insane for me. I couldn't do it. So part of the deal with this is that you have to get people excited about your startup, right? So my roommate, he has a startup called Bamboo, and he creates these hypothermia bracelets for babies, and it tracks whether the baby gets hypothermic or not. And whenever he goes and pitches, so he's actually pitching in DC right now, but he gets up in front of the audience and he says, he goes, raise your hand if you've ever been a baby. Everybody raises their hand, they're just like, this is hilarious. And he says, now raise your hand if you were premature when you were a baby. And then people lower their hands, and you have the people, he kind of addresses the significant pain right there. And the amazing thing is, like, people connect with that instantly. So they say, like, oh, I was premature. So I think that's a genius way to start a video. So then there's the investor pitch. And the investor pitch is generally around 20 minutes, 10 to 20 minutes, depending on what you're talking about, who you're talking to. And when you go to a VC, when people come to us, they sit down in this conference room, and you have your presentation up there, and they really want to get into the nitty-gritty of what your startup does. Because by the time that they invited you to their office, that means that you've been talking to them a couple of times before, right? So they know what you're doing, they know like what you're about, what your startup's about in general, but they really want to get into the nitty-gritty about like what you actually plan for like the next 12 to 18 months, 5 years of your startup. And this is where it's kind of tricky because you have a lot of startups that come in and like try to put everything on their slides. Don't do that. Just keep your deck nice and clean, the same way that you would when you like do a pitch, like a demo day pitch. But if it's helpful, let's say that you you send your pitch your deck ahead of time. It's a lot better to give them like an Excel PowerPoint or like an additional bullet points to complement that PowerPoint versus flooding your PowerPoint with data and stuff like that. And there's a template for that in I think like an investor pitch as well. So what we're focusing on today is the demo day pitch / pitch competition, right? Because that's what you guys are responsible for. So rather than thinking like an investor, let's think about who's in that audience. So who's going to be on the judging panel?
VCs.
VCs? Okay, so you can't think like an investor. Perfect. So the first thing is to really hook them. Invite them into that pitch and make sure that it resonates with them. And then the big thing is to make sure that you have all the content that kind of explains your startup story, and then make sure that you practice that and keep everything clean. So the big question is, what are the most interesting things about your startup? And can you easily explain those things? Because if you're an early stage startup, you're probably not going to have the most spectacular traction. Or maybe you're missing a team member or something like that. Your goal is to really highlight those most exciting things. And rule number 1 is that it's not about you, it's about your audience. So make sure that you're selling the opportunity and not the product, right? Because as much as I'm interested in the technology that you might have, I'm really interested in what that technology can do for other people. So that's what you have to focus on. So get your mindset out of the product and the technology and focus on what it is for you. Did you guys see Kanye West on Ellen? Did anybody watch that video? You watched it? Okay. So that's why I put it up there. Basically, Kanye took over the show and like had this diatribe, and Ellen was just standing there being like, oh my god, I don't know what the hell's going on. So is this problem worth solving? And do I resonate with that? Do I connect to that problem? So when we're talking about story, again, it's not necessarily the entrepreneur's story, the entrepreneur's journey, but it's the story of your startup. So let's say that you have this spectacular team. You really want to highlight that and kind of show the story of your startup with all the things that you have to talk about, let's say in that deck that I showed you. So really focus it on that. If you have significant traction, that's kind of the end deal. If you have great traction, then VC will be like, well, okay, this is serious. Do you have a significant disruptive technology? And usually what happens with vision, so if you have a very, very early stage startup, let's say that they're almost in idea stage, that's when they kind of like focus more on that vision, right? Because they don't really have that much to back up. And this is a big one, so avoid using that jargon and those buzzwords, because not everybody's going to understand exactly what you're talking about, so make sure that you can explain it to everyone. Do you guys know the 30-20-10 rule? Yeah? Okay, so this is Guy Kawasaki's rule, and you're going to have to adapt this because you don't have 20 minutes, you only have, what, 7 minutes? So this is more of like a 37. So basically what he says is that your font should be greater than 30, so don't have small font. It should take no more than 20 minutes, so this is more for the investor side, and there should be no more than 10 slides. And the reality is, like, you're going to find a lot of different templates. If you go and Google like pitch templates and things like that, you're going to find a lot of different ones. And a lot of them are going to have like similar things like, oh, well, maybe I should have like team first, or maybe I should have my traction first, or maybe I should put my value proposition first. It doesn't necessarily matter so much as the story you're telling and how that fits together, right? So you kind of build and build. There's a lot of resources in that PDF that I sent you, so please go through them. There's a lot of interesting like TED Talks and different decks and things like that. And I like this one because my mentor Dan tells me this all the time. So when we're talking about be the doctor, you know, when you're getting cut open in surgery, you're not going to trust somebody that shows up in like a t-shirt and shorts, right? There's a doctor and he has a coat and he says, okay, I'm going to cut you open today. And, you know, if it was just a normal human being, you'd be like, no way, I'm not letting you cut me open. So if you get up there and you have the presence, you say like, yes, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm going to cut you open today. That's what you're looking for. And a funny thing that Dan always tells me is like, you know, when a surgeon makes a mistake, he doesn't say oops. So let's say that he makes the incorrect decision. He goes, there. That's it. There are no oopses. So here are top tips, which we just went through. Does anybody have any questions before we keep going? Is this interesting at all?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.